Hello everyone and welcome to our Net Zero Visions Question Time event. This is a really exciting event because it's such a big and relevant issue to all of us. What net zero is going to look like, it will affect all of our day-to-day lives massively, and it couldn't be more pressing. So we've got some really great speakers today to discuss what our net zero vision looks like. Hopefully it will be able to give you a picture of what net zero actually means to you, to all of us, and what it's going to take to get there. The term is thrown around so much, and of course whether we get there will be really dependent on the policies put in place to achieve this goal. So this is why we've got speakers from different positions on the political spectrum, which will hopefully be able to flesh out these different scenarios. I realise I should have introduced myself already. My name's Flossie Boyd. I am the Public Affairs Officer at RenewableUK. And the other speakers we have today are Sophie Cowen from Extinction Rebellion, Chris Saltmarsh from Labour for a Green New Deal, and Jack Richardson from the Conservative Environment Network. But before our speakers introduce themselves, I want to just give a little bit of context in case you're new to net zero and climate change. As I'm sure you'll all be aware, the science makes it undeniable that the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is set to cause catastrophic climate change that would be completely destructive to all living things on Earth. But that is unless we see greenhouse gases, and this is where net zero comes in. We have a legally binding target to stop contributing emissions to the atmosphere by 2050. And net zero basically means that there's an overall balance between emissions produced by factories or cars and then emissions removed through natural solutions like trees and peat bogs, or technologies like carbon capture and storage. So, and then also there's gross net zero, which would mean that we would stop producing emissions altogether. But our target is for net zero. So, I mean, just from looking around you, you'll know that our roads are still full of petrol guzzling cars, and the boiler in your house is probably still fired on gas. So there's a long way to go to get to net zero, and you can probably imagine that our world could look very different when we get there. So let's get started and introduce our excellent guests who will tell us their visions of what a net zero society could look like and how we get there. So Sophie.
Hi, my name is Sophie Cowen. Introduction and a bit of a vision, is that what I'm doing?
If you just introduce yourself and XR, and then we'll go into your visions after intros.
Okay, well, my name is Sophie Cowen. My background is kind of advertising and media, and then in 2019 I found a small group of people that were about to block some bridges. So I set up a media team with that group, and since then I've been organising large-scale civil disobedience actions, drawing attention to the climate and ecological emergency. So yeah, that's me. Extinction Rebellion continues to put pressure on the government because, you know, we're going to get into a discussion about why that's necessary, and it's non-violent direct action is what we do, and I can talk more about that, but you can also find out more about it online too.
My name's Chris Saltmarsh. I'm a climate justice campaigner. I'm a socialist member of the Labour Party, and I'm a writer. I co-founded Labour for a Green New Deal a couple of years ago, which is a campaign group in and around the Labour Party and the Labour movement. And my first book is coming out in September. It's called Burned: Fighting for Climate Justice, and you can pre-order it now anywhere where you might expect to.
Bit of a gentle plug there. Lovely. Thanks, Chris. And Jack.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for having me on. I'm the Climate Programmes Manager at the Conservative Environment Network. We're a forum for conservation, conservatives who believe in conservation and decarbonisation. A lot of our work's on for our Parliamentary caucus, which is about 110 backbench peers or MPs or so. But yeah, a bit like Sophie, but in a slightly different way, we're trying to put pressure on the government and to really increase its ambition when it comes to climate and nature crises.
Great, thank you, Jack. Yeah, so to kick off, I think it would be great to get a kind of summary from each of you of what net zero looks like. What is net zero? What can we expect that world to look like in a few minutes each? Should we start off with Sophie, seeing as we're going in order?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to point out first and foremost that my vision for net zero is it actually happening. I feel as though we talk about it a lot and the changes aren't really being made, and that's why we're all here. So yeah, I vision a road where the government's promises to get to net zero aren't complemented by expansions to airports, massive road investment, new coal mines, and most recently a new oil exploration project in the North Sea, as reported by the Times front page yesterday. So yeah, it would be great if we could get going on it. What would this look like on a day-to-day level for me? You know, I'd see more trees, more cyclists, more insulated homes, more people being able to afford cars that they can drive that aren't going to produce loads of emissions. All of these things that, you know, feel kind of almost utopian, but actually are just things that will massively improve our mental health, our community.
I think Sophie might be cutting out a bit there, but the other panelists getting that. Okay, so Sophie's internet has gone a bit fuzzy, so I think we can come back to her later and hopefully explore more about her perspective on net zero. But I suppose interestingly, there was quite a lot of emphasis on how maybe individual life will change and there'll be more active travel and the way we drive will be different. And I wonder, Jack, what's your vision like in comparison to that? Maybe what opportunities will be presented to us in a net zero society?
Yeah, so Sophie kind of said it's like utopian, but I don't think it's not that utopian because it's kind of happening already. So on transport, for instance, we're going to hopefully see a massive modal shift from emphasis on personal car use over to buses and trains, which will hopefully be powered by a whole range of low carbon technologies, like whether it's hydrogen or batteries or maybe electrification. And then we'll see more people on scooters and e-bikes or just normal bikes if you're a lot healthier than I am. And still EVs, of course, but hopefully using cars in a smarter way. So maybe car clubs, which are becoming really popular in Germany, to use cars more efficiently. But it's definitely about making transport more efficient. I think in the home, it's going to change as well. Hopefully we're going to see a lot more energy efficiency. So a lot warmer, cozier houses, which are cheaper to keep warm. Maybe we'll have a driveway that has a charge point, so you can plug in your EV and you can charge it overnight when the electricity is cheaper, or you can sell your power back to the grid and make your car a battery for your house or for the national grid. And I think third, just on my crystal ball for net zero, the third sort of big noticeable thing, so a lot of net zero is going to happen in the background, but the third one would definitely be a massive sort of reindustrialization of the country. So with all these new technologies like lithium mining in Cornwall, for example, to make sure that we're getting batteries sourced in the UK, or maybe carbon sequestration. So we'll be able to, Germany might capture a load of carbon, sell it over to us to store in the North Sea, because we're blessed to have the North Sea with lots of space to stick a load of carbon underground. So I think it's going to be a lot of jobs, a better standard of living. And I think the crux of it is that a lot of people think that net zero is necessarily about doing less. I feel it's more about doing less of the environmentally damaging stuff, which we've been doing a lot of, because that's what we've based our standard of living on since the Industrial Revolution. We need to stop doing that and find better ways of doing it. But in order to get our way out of this massive environmental hole that we've dug ourselves in, you actually need to repair your relationship with nature or get yourself out of the climate crisis. And I think that actually takes doing more, which hopefully there's a lot of jobs in to sort of power the economy.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be many of the attendees today will be working in some way in the green industry in the future. We hope so. And Chris, do you agree that this kind of change, a lot of it will be happening in the background, or do you think there's going to be big fundamental shifts? Be good to know what your vision looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think, you know, in terms of what are the outcomes, I think I probably share a lot of what Sophie and Jack have said. I guess maybe where there might be differences around what is that process to get there? What will the next 10, 15 years be like? I think for me, you know, I campaign for a Green New Deal. And for me, what that means is, one, it's about putting net zero, not just as the only focus, but as one part of a broader kind of vision of climate and economic justice, but also economic transformation. So I think, you know, I think this is about mobilizing really the entire economy. So every element of our economy and society needs to be geared towards this challenge over the next 10 and 15 years. So in some ways, that's just about changing our collective mindset and our political focus. But also, I think changing how the economy works and how the economy runs. I think, for us, one of the big things is that we can talk about our kind of shared vision for net zero or for climate justice, but there are some necessary preconditions in order to achieve that. And actually, I think our analysis is that within this kind of capitalist economy that we have, the profit motive and the private sector and the market make it very difficult to achieve a lot of these things, because profit is kind of necessarily put ahead of other concerns like social justice and decarbonisation. And so what we'd want to see is an expansion of public ownership across the economy. So many industries and sectors that have been privatized over the past few decades brought back into public ownership, and then allowing that to have more of a kind of regime of centralized planning and democratic planning of what those new industries will be. And I think, that transition from polluting industries, whether that's fossil fuels or aviation, into green industries and green technologies and those green jobs, that's going to have to happen incredibly quickly. And there's real questions of justice and fairness around that. And so I think in order for that to be as quick as possible and as fair as possible, we need to almost change kind of how the economy is working. So much more of it is going through the state, much more of it is kind of has the democratic oversight of workplaces and communities, and much less of it is left to the free market. And finally, as well, just wanted to mention, I think really importantly, when we're talking about these things, we mustn't ignore the kind of international perspective. We must have a domestic industrial strategy, but we must make sure that the investments we're making here within the borders of the UK, they're also shared internationally through reparations, through transfers of wealth and finance, in order that this is a collective kind of global effort.
Thanks, Chris. I suppose that's an interesting point about the need for privatisation and not just being our response to the climate crisis, not just being driven by profit fundamentally if you're living in a capitalist society. So I suppose that makes me want to ask Jack a question. Do you think that privatised market-led change is really enough to solve the climate crisis? Obviously, we've seen quite a lot of success in the wind industry. It would be good to know your thoughts.
A lot of the private sector is actually it's coming out ahead of a lot of governments, and I feel like markets, they're not the be all and end all. It's not all about business and profits, but they do certainly have a lot of power, and I think the government's role is coming up with the framework and the regulations to encourage them to go the right way, maybe by making companies come up with Paris-aligned transition plans, for example. But as you said, the wind sector is a sort of perfect example. The profit motive has been used to turn the UK into a textbook study on how to decarbonize your power supply, because it's enabled energy to go down from 114 quid per kilowatt hour in early 2010s down to sub £40 now, and I think it's going to be down to about £20, and it's actually now seeing globally renewable energy is starting to outcompete fossil fuels. So I feel like you can't underestimate the sort of power of markets, and I feel like you just need to, maybe the government does need a bit more regulation and frameworks to make sure that it's encouraging markets and businesses to go in the right direction. But I'm not sure we've got time to sort of rewire and come up with a British socialist state just in time for the climate crisis. It's quite a big ask. I think we just need to be getting on with the right policy immediately.
Thanks, Jack. Kind of moving on slightly, given that some of our audience members, I'm sure, will be members of either the Conservative or Labour Party, or have an interest in either left-wing or right-wing politics, or no politics at all, and have more of the XR line that we need to go beyond politics to achieve change. It would be good to know from each of you where you think we should be pushing our respective parties to be more ambitious, or how we can put pressure on government to go beyond politics, beyond party politics, to create this change. So, Chris, do you have any key areas where you feel that Labour should really be being more ambitious?
Yeah, absolutely. And as Labour for a Green New Deal, we're all Labour members, but we're not, as an organisation, affiliated to the party. So our reason to exist is very much to push the party further. That's why we were set up. a couple of years ago. And I think, yeah, there are some key things really. And, you know, obviously we're promoting this kind of broader program of a Green New Deal, but I think there's some really key metrics to understand when a Green New Deal is really radical and ambitious and when it's actually just kind of fluff and words. I think first is scale of investment. I think, you know, we've spoken a lot about the pace of decarbonisation in this country, and we just had a little bit of a conversation just now about the methods. I think what we've not talked about so much, both within the Labour Party and in politics more broadly, is, well, exactly how much money are we putting into this? You know, we've just had over 10 years of austerity in which public spending and public investment has been really quashed. And I think that's been a historically, you know, bad time to do that, just as we're about to face a crisis of the climate change, which will require huge amounts of investment. And, you know, I always kind of look to the Democratic primaries that recently happened in the US for the presidential election, and you could see a real difference in ambition based on how much each candidate was willing to invest. So I always remember that Bernie Sanders pledged, I think, $16.3 trillion of public investment as part of his Green New Deal, and then other candidates had maybe something like 3 trillion or 1 trillion, or, you know, some of it was half public investment and half private investment. And so I think for me, what Labour needs to be moving towards is saying, okay, this is our figure. This is how much, a fully costed figure that needs to be invested over the next 10, 15 years. And I think, you know, we need to make an argument to really fully put the nail in the coffin of austerity on that, because if these kind of austerity arguments continue to lie around infrastructure spending and research spending, then we're going to be in a very tough position as we try and make some quite considerable changes over the next, you know, decade.
Thanks, Chris. And maybe coming to Sophie now, because a big part of Exile's message is moving beyond politics and maybe arguing that the decisions we face are too broken for our parliamentary system. So how do you suggest that we push for change from the standpoint of our existing system?
Yeah, so it's a big thing there beyond politics, and you know, can you hear me? Okay, I'm on hotspot now. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
I think
you're good now.
Kind of, you know, it's not that we're against the Labour Party or against the Conservatives or any of that. It's like it's not a personal thing, but it's a how do we make the changes right now that are going to be necessary to keep us going for the next however many hundreds, thousands of years. And what we're seeing is a system of politics, which I'm sure, you know, you guys will probably agree with, that just kind of repeats on itself, where you get voted in for however long, and then it just kind of doesn't really push things forward at the speed that needs to happen right now. And that's why we're all doing our jobs here. What I would say really about the ambitions then of Extinction Rebellion is really to engage it's to engage people in conversation. What we did with the big launch event in a couple of years ago, when we got, you know, thousands of people out onto the street, was actually to engage your regular person in the conversation around climate. And this is something that really, really needs to happen on a local level. You know, participatory democracy is what we're asking for. And we've seen this work within a citizens' assembly commissioned by the government, but sadly not legally binding. There were actually people in that citizens' assembly who came together, saw the information, understood what needed to change, and actually created way more radical policies than currently exist within the current government. And so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about ambition. I'm talking about actually it's the public ambition to get together to talk about what needs to change. And it's that groundswell that really needs to happen. Because if we don't actually keep talking and then turning that into action by getting out on the street, talking to your friends down the pub, you know, just doing, then the parties themselves are not going to do it quick enough. And that's essentially, you know, what we're standing for. And we all know that it's a speed thing, and we need essentially pressure from the public. Otherwise, the government just won't do anything to change. And just to end slightly on that point is, I think you know, I obviously think the Green New Deal is a fantastic initiative. But I also recognise that we don't have an election for another 3 years. So this current government could do what we need to do if they just took on the responsibility. So it's about putting pressure on the government right now, which is what Jack's clearly doing. And we need to do it from a bigger perspective. And of course, Chris is doing it as well. We need to do it from a groundswell, from people that don't really want to just get involved in politics, but they just want to be part of making the change. So essentially that's the power of civil disobedience movements, is to come out and say that they're not going to stand for the way that politics is currently running. Yeah, and all audience members, I mean, are able to participate in civil disobedience and push their respective parties on any of the issues we're discussing today. So I hope you're finding it useful to highlight some of these issues. And Jack, so on that, I suppose, what are the key things that we should be pushing the Conservatives?
So, so we've got our main two things are a council network, which is sort of doing all the work at the local authority level to try and get councils to up their ambition. And we're seeing some pretty good stuff coming out of that. There's like lots of 2025, 2030 council targets. And then we've got our parliamentary caucus. And I feel like they're sort of like the real swell of parliamentary campaigning on the environment and climate in general at the moment, because they're quite well organised. I kind of feel like the environmentalist movement in the UK is kind of a bit like a football team, in that you've got Sophie and XR trying to do that sort of grassroots groundswell, trying to get climate up the public agenda. Like I remember when the net zero target was passed, it was Simon Clarke, who's a member of our caucus, who did a cross-party letter into government, and then meanwhile outside you had a load of XR protesters banging the drums and stuff. I feel Chris, hopefully, like he'll be able to sort of get Labour back into position, because I talked to a lot of NGOs day to day, and they sort of say that Labour's kind of falling behind, and I think it might be because he's worried about all these red wall voters being turned off by climate, but that's definitely not the case, because you see the last local elections, Ben Huchin and Andy Street, who are really ambitious on the climate, and they've got their green industrial revolution policies being put forward, and they won the vote by like 75%. So I feel like it's definitely a sort of team, and we all have different roles. Obviously, we've got our caucus, and they're trying to squeeze every ounce of ambition out of out of the government, as it's bringing forward all these strategies, like the heat and building strategy, the hydrogen strategy, the biomass strategy next year, transport decarbonisation plan, and net zero review. So it's all about trying to get the government to do as much as possible, as soon as possible. Great, thanks, Jack. Yeah, it's nice, that metaphor of seeing the fight to tackle climate change as a football team. We are all in this together. I've stolen it off someone else. I think they're going to kill me. Huh? I stole it off someone else. I don't think they're going to be very happy if I don't credit them. I think it's a nice thing to be passing on. So we've had a couple of mining for rare metals to build technologies like wind farms. And I suppose that kind of brings up an important question, which is, how far can technology be the solution to climate change, and how far are we going to have to change our behaviours? What role are these two things going to have, and what balance will there be? Because obviously there are some environmentally detrimental impacts of certain technologies, and some technologies are so far away in being scalable and useful, like having electric airplanes or capturing carbon out of the atmosphere using technology, that it can be dangerous to invest in these policies in case it is causing debate in other areas of action. So we have a few polls that we were going to launch just to see what the audience think about how far we should be relying on technology and how far we should be relying on behavioural change. So it'd be great if we could launch. Yeah. So I'm going to click my options as well. Yeah, and it's, huh? I'm sad I can't vote. I know, me too. I was just really excited to vote and then saw that I couldn't. But it will be interesting to see how everyone votes on these. So in the meantime, whilst everyone casts their votes, it would be good to hear from you guys on what you think the balance should be. So Chris, going to you, what do you think, how far do you think we're going to have to change the way that we behave and live our lives, especially considering how difficult some industries are to decarbonise? Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think for me, obviously there'll have to be significant investment in new technologies, and it's just unavoidable that technological kind of revolutions will be a massive part of this.
I prefer to think about it not as behavior change, but lifestyle change. I think it's also undeniable that elements of our lifestyles will, of course, change. The way we'll travel will have to be different. Hopefully, as has already been mentioned, that'll be far more by public transport compared to private cars. Hopefully, you know, there'll be less aviation. Hopefully, what we eat and how we eat will be different. I think those are, you know, some of the necessary things where decarbonisation will be among the most difficult. But I think for me, what's really crucial is I think you hit a pretty low ceiling quite quickly of people who are willing to voluntarily change their behaviours on those things for the climate. And so, you know, I think you hit a pretty low ceiling on people who will give up flying forever. You'll hit a pretty low ceiling on people who will voluntarily become vegan or vegetarian. So what I think we need to do through investment, through regulation, through kind of restructuring how the economy and various services work is make the greenest choice the cheapest choice and the easiest choice. And so that's about, as I say, re-engineering transport networks, re-engineering food systems, making sure that food, for example, is being provided as a basic right, but that food that's being provided is also is sustainable, and making sure that transport is as cheap as possible. Maybe public transport should be free in a lot of places, if not in all instances, and again, kind of incentivizing people giving up their private cars, and where private cars do exist, having them maybe pooled, as I think Jack mentioned before. And so I think for me, this is it's really important to push against a tendency towards a kind of eco-austerity, because I think fundamentally, if you want to build a popular consent for the changes that are going to need to happen, what we need to talk about is a new kind of abundance and prosperity through these kind of shared resources and these public services. I don't think we're going to get people on board if what we're preaching is a kind of austere environmentalism of, you know, your life's going to be worse, but don't worry because the planet's not going to be on fire. You know, ultimately we need to sell a vision to people of a prosperous future where, you know,
Yeah, I know, Sophie, you mentioned a zero society and that maybe we need to stop flying every year all the time, and maybe the changes could actually create a really nice way of life, and it doesn't have to mean sacrifice. Do you want to say a little bit more about that perspective?
Yeah, I think this kind of comes back to a really key part of my vision, which is so based on actually having people coming to those decisions about what happens in their communities, what happens in their counties and their regions, coming to those decisions together, because no one really likes being told what to do. And so if we can actually create a structure, essentially, of politics, which is happening, and you know, it is already happening, but I would really encourage anyone that's like interested in really creating behavioural change, cultural change, which is really, I believe, what we need in order for, you know, things to actually for them to happen in a way that is a smooth transition, to get involved in local politics, to get involved in your local movements. Don't just watch movements like Extinction Rebellion happen and go, oh God, good for you. I get this a lot. I'm so glad there's people like you doing that, Soph. And I'm like, yeah, okay. We actually need everyone to be getting involved in order to make it more normal to be talking about these things, and not like sort of climate preachy, which is really, really annoying. So it's local decision making, participatory democracy, which is what we're talking about with our third demand of a citizens' assembly, which is this kind of bigger version of people coming together from different experiences, different parts of, you know, some people might love driving their car, some people might like, you know, fly every year, some people might be, you know, hardcore vegetarian. But if everyone can come together and understand a little bit more about the perspectives that each other are coming from, then that's where actually community is created, and the policies are more likely to be sort of essentially got into place more quickly, because the government will actually see them being wanted. So it's about making decisions together as opposed to just waiting for them to happen top down.
Absolutely. So behaviour change doesn't just need to be not eating meat or giving up your car. It can also just mean participating in local democracy and being active on this issue. And so, Jack, do you want to come in on this? Because I know that traditionally conservative environmentalism has been a bit more techno-optimistic as opposed to looking for big changes in behaviours, and I wondered, do you think that's enough? I mean, you've obviously said earlier that some behaviour changes need to happen, but to what extent?
Yeah, so I think there's a bit of a false dichotomy. I'm first going to dispel this sort of legend that we're all Conservatives relying on direct air captures to come and save the day. We're definitely not. But you can also sort of say that people kind of thought offshore wind was too expensive, so you do sort of need to invest in these future technologies now in order to scale them up, like CCS, for example. I think behavior change is kind of already happening anyway, like vegetarianism and vegans gone through the roof. You see supermarkets putting them next to meat alternatives. Some people are like pick them up more. People are going to companies which are more environmentally minded. And I think in terms of technology, definitely don't rely on the ones which aren't certain. Don't try and plan your future on that. But you do need to start bringing behavior change to technologies which can help a lot now. And this is a bit like what Chris was saying earlier. So the example I've got in mind is heat pumps. We need to make them the sort of natural way to heat your homes. That would take a bit of government support, a bit like we did with offshore wind. And then you'll get trailblazing members of society who will get a heat pump when it's a bit more expensive, and that will start scaling up the heat pump market. And then they'll hopefully go to the school gates, dropping off their kids, and they'll go on and on to their neighbours about how sick their heat pumps are, basically, and how they've slashed their electricity bills by 90%. And then you'll get a social tipping point as all the other parents start going, well, we also need a heat pump. So I think it's kind of like it's not, you don't rely on just behavior change and technology. Like we've got, like, technology is always progressing. You need investment in technology. You need that to make that technology the more attractive option. Like Chris was saying, I'd probably do it in slightly different ways than Chris, obviously. But then obviously, yeah, you do need people to drive behavior change, and that's where Sophie comes in, because she's encouraging everyone to be more environmentally conscious and to get involved.
Absolutely. And we've had a direct question to you on what do you think the Tories would think about a total ban on private jets? Will they get behind it?
I know the person who asked this. This is the person who I was asking for a link before this started. So I'll let that know. I don't know. I'm going to put it to the Secret Council. I think the Tories would probably prefer that private jets just decarbonise and we get like electric planes or something, because I don't think Conservatives are necessarily in the business of taking people's stuff away from them, but definitely do need to decarbonise aviation, obviously.
Yeah. So could we share the results from the poll? Because it would be interesting to know what the audience think. So 96% of the audience think that our government is not doing enough to tackle climate change. And I think probably all of our panelists agree on that. And then on meeting net zero, interestingly, a lot of you think that behaviour change is more important than technology. So that's 73% of you. And most of you have reduced your meat consumption, which is really interesting, seeing as you're all students and the next generation. It's kind of promising that probably significant behaviour change is possible. I mean, we all know that we're cutting down meat, but it's great to see it in numbers. And cutting down flying is more of a 50-50 one. It is. I feel like we all have a huge appetite to go abroad at the moment, having been cooped up for the last few years from this pandemic. Yeah, so I think considering the described happening in society as a result of trying to reach net zero, we've got to consider that there's going to be a huge amount of people who are going to have to transition from one industry to another, from fossil fuel polluting industries to green industries. And obviously that's really challenging. How are we going to get there whilst protecting jobs and communities and making sure that we bring everyone with us? And the discussion around this point is about the just transition. How do we make this transition just and not just green? So it would be really interesting to quickly hear from each of you about what a just transition means to you. We don't have a huge amount of time left, so it'd be good if you could keep it short. But yeah, Sophie, do you want to come in on what a just transition means to you?
Well, two quite straightforward examples. One really key thing would be if we could insulate all the homes in Britain. I think that would be a good first step. And we need to put pressure on the government to do that, because that is something that starts very much at home, and is absolutely vital. The second thing is around actually internationally. There's a recent study by the Fair Shares Group out of the Stockholm Environment Institute, who basically look at what would a fair share of the carbon emissions for the UK look like. And they looked at, based on historical contributions from 1990 of the UK, they divided the shares out per capita, and they came to the conclusion that we need to reduce to net zero by 2030 in order to have our fair share. And I think this is really, really key, because we're saying that we're world leaders, and essentially we've got a date that is shitting on everyone else. And secondly, if we're world leaders, that still isn't enough, because, you know, Kevin Anderson recently said, if we get to net zero by 2050, that could still be 2.5 to 3 degrees warming. And so it's not enough to compare ourselves to everyone else, because no one's doing enough. So I think this just transition for me is actually about telling the truth. And I'm really, really fed up of being lied to by the government with their 10-point shiny plan, which is actually doing bugger all right now. So
I might take that to Chris and just see what you think about the need to bring our targets forward. Because Labour for a Green New Deal have got a 2030 zero carbon target. How can we ensure a just transition with such a short timeline to reach zero emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think targets are important because they set the pace for the wider programme. And I think having a really ambitious target of something like 2030 is also really important from an internationalist perspective. I think it commits us to international justice. And if we're talking about fair share, you know, we can say, well, the UK's fair share right now is reducing about 200% of our emissions. So that's 100% of our emissions really, really quickly. And then about 100% again in international finance. So it's, yeah, from that perspective, it's really imperative that it goes really quickly. And then I think that question of how do you do that fairly and with justice is incredibly important. And I think that's why we support a more planned economy, because it means that you could have the state managing this transition incredibly quickly, but also making sure that kind of fairness is there as well. And so I think, you know, we were talking before about, well, the market has produced more renewables, and that's certainly true. But I think what a market-led transition towards renewables hasn't done is actually phase out fossil fuels. And so what we're seeing is we're still producing fossil fuels, we're just also pumping more renewable energy into the mix as well. But those emissions are continuing to rise because the fossil fuels aren't being cut out. And so what we need to make sure is through that planned transition, we're creating those good green jobs that are well paid, they're secure, they have the same terms and conditions, better terms and conditions from the polluting industries, but also that we're re-empowering kind of trade unions and making sure that we're protecting trade union rights, because too often those jobs created in the renewable sector by the market aren't actually very good jobs. They're not well organized, they're not well paid, and they're not secure. And so that's why I think we need that planned economy that is democratically kind of overseen by communities and by workplaces as well.
So Jack, I think that quite neatly takes the question on to you. How can we ensure in a market-led transition that jobs are fair and well regulated?
Well, so first, I think this is the reason why the Conservatives sort of stick to this independently expert-advised 2050 target, because you kind of need to rejig all of the economy. You could so a just transition means not just shutting down everyone's jobs without them having the new industries which need scaling up to go over to, like clean steel or hydrogen production or CCS. Like you can't just like phase out fossil fuels overnight. One, because that would shut down all our hospitals and schools, and people won't be able to get food because you can't go driving on the roads to transport food everywhere. So there's nothing just about putting all this costs onto normal people. And so yeah, and then secondly, on the world leadership case, you need the UK to actually take the transition seriously, do it slowly, make sure people are transferred over to, which is going to take a lot of investment in skills, because we don't have the workforce for net zero yet. We need to train them up, particularly getting women and girls into STEM subjects, because we're not going to get to net zero with half our brain power. But you need the UK to take that transition seriously, do it properly, take time and money in doing it. So not in 2030. It's basically impossible. A tree doesn't grow that fast, frankly. And then that way you avoid the sort of a massive sort of gilets jaunes moment scaring off all the other countries from doing 2030 because they look at the UK and everyone's living standards have plummeted and they've got no jobs because you've just cut the energy supply overnight. So I think a just transition is about doing it properly and making sure that people actually maintain their standard of living throughout. Otherwise, you're just going to see this consensus, which we're really lucky to have in the UK.
Thanks, Jack. Sorry, we've got 1 minute left. So
steroids.
Yeah, balancing ambition with making sure that we protect our communities is going to be a huge challenge, and something that Renewable UK is working really closely with industry on. But I would just love to thank all of our speakers and sponsors for this really interesting discussion. We've got more webinars coming up 18th of July, so please do sign up to that if you would like to attend. It would be great to have you there, and more events coming up, including our global offshore wind event in September. We have a survey, and it would be great if you could complete that and feed it back. And also, this webinar is being recorded, so if you want to watch anything back, then feel free to. Again, it was really great to talk with you guys, and thank you so much. I'm really sorry we didn't get around to answering all the questions, but yeah, it's been a bit pressed. So thanks so much, everyone, and I hope you all get involved with climate activism.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye.